On May 23, 2010, at 6:30 p.m., 28-year-old attorney Mércia Nakashima left her grandmother's house in Guarulhos, a city in Greater São Paulo, Brazil. She was heading home. She never made it. 19 days later, a fisherman made a grim discovery at the Atibainha Reservoir, about 50 miles north of São Paulo. Mércia's body was inside her submerged vehicle, and the investigation that followed would become one of the most scientifically complex criminal cases in Brazilian history, employing forensic techniques that had never been used in a Brazilian court before. If you appreciate in-depth, respectful investigations, please like this video and subscribe to Brazil's Crime Vault. It really helps us bring more cases to light. This is the Mércia Nakashima case, a homicide investigation that demonstrated how microscopic plant life, cellular technology, and methodical detective work can speak when a killer stays silent. Mércia Nakashima was a rising attorney in São Paulo, the largest city in South America and one of the most populous metropolitan areas in the world, with over 20 million people. She had graduated from law school and was building her practice, known among colleagues and family as dedicated, intelligent, and focused on her career. She was of Japanese descent, part of Brazil's significant Japanese-Brazilian community, the largest outside Japan itself. In early 2010, she had recently ended a relationship with Misael Bispo de Souza, a man with two professional identities. He was both a sergeant in the São Paulo Military Police, one of the largest police forces in Latin America, and a licensed attorney who had recently passed the Brazilian bar exam. Their relationship had been intense, spanning approximately 2 years, but according to official records presented during trial, Mércia had decided to move on. She had started seeing someone else, an engineer, a fact that would become central to the prosecution's theory of motive. On that Sunday evening in May, Mércia told her family she was going home after spending the afternoon with her grandmother in Guarulhos. She drove her silver Fiat Stilo. Security cameras captured her leaving the residential area at approximately 6:45 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Mércia didn't answer calls from family members that night and failed to appear at work the following day, Monday, May 24th, her relatives contacted authorities immediately. This was highly unusual behavior for Mércia, who was known to be punctual and communicative. In Brazil, missing persons cases are initially handled by specialized divisions within the Polícia Civil, which is the state-level investigative police force responsible for criminal investigations, similar to detective divisions in the United States. The case was registered as a disappearance on May 24, 2010. Investigators immediately began tracing Mércia's last known movements. Her family provided crucial information. Mércia had recently ended her relationship with Misael and had expressed concerns about his reaction, though no formal restraining order had been filed. Phone records became the first breakthrough. According to court documents, cellular tower data showed that Mércia's phone and Misael's phone were in the same location on the evening of May 23rd near the General Hospital of Guarulhos around 7 p.m. This was significant because when questioned by police, Misael claimed he had not seen Mércia that day and had been at home. The phone records told a different story. Detectives discovered that Misael had left his own vehicle, a white Ford EcoSport, parked near the hospital on the night of May 23rd. Surveillance footage confirmed his car remained there overnight, untouched. Witness testimony later revealed that Misael's vehicle was picked up the next morning, Monday, May 24th, by an acquaintance, a security guard named Evandro Bezerra Silva. This raised an immediate question for investigators. Why would Misael, a police officer, leave his car in a public area overnight and arrange for someone else to retrieve it the following day? According to the case file, when confronted with this evidence, Misael told investigators he had been home that evening and provided an alibi. But the phone tower data directly contradicted his statement. In Brazil, as in the United States, cellular phones automatically connect to the nearest tower, and telecommunications companies maintain logs of these connections. These logs are admissible as evidence in court. On May 23rd, both Mércia's phone and Misael's phone were moving together, heading north from Guarulhos toward the rural region of Nazaré Paulista, a journey of approximately 55 miles through increasingly remote terrain. For 19 agonizing days, search teams combed highways, rural roads, and wooded areas throughout the region. Mércia's family appealed publicly for information, appearing on local television news broadcasts. Her photograph was distributed widely. The case received significant media coverage in São Paulo, particularly because Mércia was a young professional with no known enemies, and because the primary suspect was a police officer, which made the case especially sensitive. Then, on June 11, 2010, a fisherman at the Atibainha reservoir near Nazaré Paulista noticed something unusual beneath the water's surface near the shore. The water in this area is relatively clear, and he could make out the shape of a vehicle. He contacted authorities immediately. Dive teams from the São Paulo Fire Department were dispatched. What they found was Mércia's Fiat Stilo, submerged in approximately 13 feet of water, about 100 feet from the shore. The vehicle's windows were closed, the doors were locked. Mércia's body was inside, still belted in the driver's seat. The discovery location was roughly 55 miles from where she was last seen in Guarulhos, in a remote area surrounded by forest and accessible only by dirt roads. The forensic examination began immediately and would involve multiple specialized disciplines, a rarity in Brazilian criminal investigations at that time. According to the autopsy report presented in court, Mércia had sustained a gunshot wound to the face, specifically to the left cheek area. The medical examiner, Dr. Fortunato Badan Palhares, a highly respected forensic pathologist in Brazil, determined that while the gunshot caused severe trauma and would have been immediately incapacitating, the actual cause of death was drowning. Water was found in her lungs, indicating she was still alive, though likely unconscious, when the vehicle entered the water. This finding was critical. It meant Mércia had been shot, incapacitated, and then the vehicle had been pushed or driven into the reservoir while she was still breathing, unable to escape. Forensic pathologists also noted defensive injuries on her hands, suggesting a struggle had occurred before the shooting. The autopsy report indicated the shooting likely took place elsewhere, possibly inside a vehicle, and Mércia's car was then driven to the reservoir. The degree of decomposition, combined with water temperature data, was consistent with the body having been submerged for approximately 19 days. Ballistics experts examined the gunshot wound trajectory and determined the weapon used was consistent with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, a standard service weapon for military police in São Paulo. The bullet had not been recovered, likely having exited the vehicle or become embedded in the reservoir floor. No weapon was recovered from the scene despite extensive searches, including the use of metal detectors and additional dive operations. Investigators turned their attention to Misael Bispo de Souza. As a military police sergeant, he had authorized access to firearms, including 9mm service weapons, which officers are allowed to carry both on and off duty. He was brought in for formal questioning at the Homicide Division in Guarulhos. According to police reports, Misael maintained his innocence and denied any involvement. He stated he had been home on the night of May 23rd and had no knowledge of Mércia's whereabouts. He could not explain why his phone records showed him traveling to Nazaré Paulista that night. He claimed his phone might have been cloned or that the records were inaccurate. However, his alibi was contradicted not only by phone records, but also by forensic evidence that was about to emerge from a groundbreaking scientific analysis. Crime scene technicians processed Misael's Ford EcoSport, the vehicle that had been left at the hospital and retrieved by his associate. Inside the vehicle, forensic analysts from the Instituto de Criminalística, São Paulo's Forensic Science Institute, found traces of blood in multiple locations. DNA testing confirmed it was Mércia's blood. The blood was located in the trunk area, on the rear seat and on the interior door panel. This was a crucial breakthrough. It placed Mércia, injured and bleeding, inside Misael's vehicle. The blood spatter pattern suggested she had been placed in the vehicle after being shot, rather than being shot inside the vehicle. But there was more, and this is where the case became scientifically unprecedented in Brazil. Forensic botanists, specialists who analyze plant material in criminal investigations, were called in to examine organic matter found in the trunk of Misael's car. This was one of the first times in Brazilian legal history that forensic botany would play a central role in a murder conviction. The botanical analysis was conducted by experts from the University of São Paulo, including biologists specializing in aquatic plant life. They identified fragments of microscopic algae, specifically diatoms, which are single-celled organisms found in water. The species identified was consistent with samples taken from the Atibainha reservoir. More specifically, the algae matched the particular ecological profile of the shallow water area where Mércia's car was found. This was extraordinary evidence, because it suggested Misael's vehicle had been at the reservoir, near or partially in the water, and that organic material from that specific location had transferred to his car. The defense would later argue that algae is common and could have come from anywhere, but the expert testimony showed that the species and concentration were highly specific to that reservoir location. The botanical evidence was presented in a detailed forensic report that included microscopic photography and ecological analysis, demonstrating that the algae in Misael's trunk matched not just any water source, but that particular body of water. The investigative theory began to solidify, supported by multiple streams of evidence. According to the reconstruction presented by the Public Prosecutor's Office, specifically Prosecutor Rodrigo Antunes, who would later describe this case as one of the most scientifically rigorous he had ever worked on, Misael had arranged to meet Mércia on the evening of May 23rd. Phone records indicated they were together. Investigators believe Misael may have lured Mércia by claiming he wanted to discuss their relationship or return personal belongings. At some point during that encounter, possibly after an argument, Misael shot Mércia in his vehicle. He then placed her, wounded and unconscious, into the trunk of his Ford EcoSport. He drove approximately 55 miles north to the remote area near Nazaré Paulista, a journey that would have taken about an hour and a half on mostly rural roads. At the reservoir, he transferred Mércia back to her own car, likely leaving his vehicle at the water's edge, which explains the algae transfer. He then pushed or drove Mércia's Fiat Stilo into the water. The algae in his trunk suggested his vehicle had been close enough to the water's edge to come into contact with aquatic plant life, possibly when he opened the trunk near the shore or when water splashed back. After submerging Mércia's car, ensuring it sank beneath the surface, Misael returned to Guarulhos, left his car at the hospital to create a false impression of normalcy, and arranged for it to be picked up later by his associate, likely to create distance from the crime scene and to avoid being seen driving a vehicle that now contained forensic evidence. Detectives also investigated whether Misael had accomplices, and the evidence pointed to at least one person who had knowledge of the crime. Evandro Bezerra Silva, a 39-year-old security guard who worked for Misael at street markets, where Misael had a side business providing security services, became a person of interest. According to court records, Silva had helped Misael plan the logistics and had provided assistance in the aftermath, including retrieving Misael's vehicle the morning after the murder. Phone records showed Silva and Misael had been in contact multiple times on May 23rd and 24th. Silva was charged as an accessory to murder. The prosecution alleged he had helped Misael plan the crime, possibly even accompanying him part of the way, though this was never definitively proven. In August 2013, Silva was convicted and sentenced to 17 years in prison for his role in the crime. He was released on parole in January 2022 after serving approximately 10 years. What happened next in the case is a study in how legal procedures can move slowly even when evidence seems compelling. In December 2010, arrest warrants were issued for both Misael and Evandro. However, both men went into hiding. They were placed on São Paulo's most wanted list. Misael, despite being a serving police officer at the time, evaded arrest for more than a year. This became a source of significant public criticism, as many questioned how a police officer could remain a fugitive for so long. Misael finally turned himself in to authorities in February 2012, more than a year and a half after the arrest warrant was issued. Evandro was arrested 4 months later, in June 2012. The delay in bringing the case to trial was partly due to the complexity of the forensic evidence and the need for expert testimony to be prepared, and partly due to legal motions filed by the defense. The legal process in Brazil for homicide cases involves a tribunal do júri, a jury trial specifically for intentional homicide cases, a system inherited from Portuguese colonial law and later influenced by American jury trial procedures. Misael's trial began in March 2013, nearly 3 years after Mércia's death. The proceedings took place at the Court of Justice in Guarulhos, in a specially prepared courtroom. The trial lasted 4 days and was extraordinarily high profile. In an unprecedented move, the São Paulo Court of Justice authorized live audiovisual transmission of the trial, making it one of the first Brazilian murder trials to be broadcast in real time. Multiple television networks, including Globo, Brazil's largest media company, carried the proceedings. This decision was controversial, with some legal experts arguing it could prejudice the jury, but the court ruled that the public interest in the case justified the transparency. The trial became a media sensation, with millions of Brazilians following the testimony. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Rodrigo Antunes and his team, presented a case built on circumstantial and forensic evidence, but it was methodical and overwhelming in its totality. There was no confession, there were no eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, but the evidence was presented piece by piece. Cellular tower data placing Misael and Mércia together at the time she disappeared, showing their phones traveling together to Nazaré Paulista. Mércia's blood in multiple locations inside Misael's vehicle, proven through DNA analysis. The aquatic algae linking his car to the specific reservoir location where her body was found. The gunshot wound, consistent with police issue 9mm firearms. The fact that Misael, as a trained police officer, would have had the knowledge to attempt to dispose of a body in a way that might delay discovery. The testimony of Mércia's family, describing Misael's inability to accept the end of the relationship. Phone records showing Misael had called Mércia repeatedly in the days before her disappearance, often late at night. Witness testimony that Misael had made threatening statements, and the complete absence of a credible alibi. The prosecution also presented testimony from Mércia's brother, who was a biologist, and from engineers who explained the cell tower technology to the jury in accessible terms. The defense, led by attorneys Samir Haddad Jr. and Yvonne Ribeiro, both experienced criminal defense lawyers in São Paulo, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Misael had been wrongly accused. They questioned the reliability of the phone records, suggesting they could be inaccurate or manipulated. They challenged the botanical evidence as speculative, arguing that algae is found in many water sources and that the transfer could have occurred innocently. They emphasized that no weapon had been recovered, no eyewitnesses had come forward, and Misael had consistently denied involvement. They suggested alternative theories, including the possibility that Mércia had been killed by someone else entirely, perhaps someone connected to her legal work or to her new boyfriend. They portrayed Misael as a dedicated police officer and attorney who was being railroaded by circumstantial evidence. They also argued that the media coverage had created a presumption of guilt that made a fair trial impossible. Witness testimony during the trial included emotional statements from Mércia's family members, particularly her mother, who described the devastating impact of losing her daughter and the agony of the 19 days when Mércia's whereabouts were unknown. They described the relationship between Mércia and Misael as increasingly troubled in the months before her death. According to testimony, Misael had struggled to accept the end of the relationship, particularly after learning Mércia was seeing someone else. Friends testified that Mércia had expressed concern about Misael's behavior, describing him as possessive and jealous, though no formal restraining order had been filed. One witness testified that Misael had said he would never let Mércia be with anyone else, a statement the prosecution characterized as a threat. The new boyfriend also testified, describing how Mércia had seemed happy, but had mentioned that her ex was having difficulty moving on. The prosecution argued that jealousy and possessiveness were the clear motivations behind the killing, a classic case of what would later be legally defined as feminicide, though this case predated Brazil's feminicide law, which was enacted in 2015 and increased penalties for homicides committed against women in domestic contexts or motivated by gender-based violence. On March 14, 2013, after deliberating for several hours, the jury of 7 citizens returned a guilty verdict. The vote was not unanimous, as Brazilian law requires only a majority for conviction in jury trials, but it was decisive. Misael Bispo de Souza was convicted of the intentional homicide of Mércia Nakashima, with multiple aggravating factors, including the use of a firearm, the fact that the victim was unable to defend herself, and the use of a method that ensured the victim had no chance of survival. Judge Leandro Jorge Bittencourt Cano sentenced Misael to 20 years in prison, which was at the higher end of the sentencing range. In subsequent appeals, the sentence was increased. In June 2017, an appellate court added additional time for procedural reasons and for the specific circumstances of the crime, bringing the total sentence to 22 years and 8 months. Misael continued to maintain his innocence through the appeals process, a stance he maintains to this day. His legal team filed multiple motions over the following years, including habeas corpus petitions seeking his release, arguing that the conviction was based on insufficient evidence. All of these appeals were denied by higher courts, including the São Paulo Court of Justice and the Superior Tribunal of Justice, Brazil's higher court for non-constitutional matters. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Misael was temporarily released to house arrest due to a judicial order related to prison overcrowding and health concerns, a controversial decision that sparked public outcry. However, that decision was quickly overturned by the Superior Tribunal of Justice following an appeal by prosecutors, and he was ordered back to prison. He is currently serving his sentence in the semi-open regime at a correctional facility in Tremembe, São Paulo, which means he is allowed to work outside the prison during the day, but must return at night. Under Brazilian law, inmates can progress to less restrictive custody conditions based on good behavior and time served, typically after serving 1/6 of their sentence for first-time offenders, or 1/4 for more serious crimes. Misael qualified for the semi-open regime based on these criteria, though this has been controversial given the nature of his crime. What is remarkable is how long it took for the professional consequences to catch up with Misael's criminal conviction. In 2022, 12 years after the murder, Misael Bispo de Souza was formally expelled from the military police of São Paulo. This extraordinarily long delay occurred because Brazilian law requires a separate administrative process to dismiss a public employee, even one convicted of murder. The public prosecutor's office had to file a specific petition requesting his dismissal, and this was only granted in April 2022. Until that point, Misael was technically still a police sergeant, though suspended, which meant he was still entitled to certain benefits. In 2023, 13 years after the crime, he was also disbarred by the OAB, the Brazilian Bar Association, which is the national organization that regulates the legal profession in Brazil. Again, this required a separate disciplinary proceeding. He has continued to file legal actions even from prison, including multiple defamation lawsuits against media outlets, journalists, and television programs that have discussed the case. He has sued Globo Television Network, Record Network, and individual reporters, claiming that continued coverage violates his right to be forgotten, a legal concept in Brazilian law that allows individuals to request the removal of old information about them from public discourse. These efforts have been largely unsuccessful. Courts have consistently ruled that the Mércia Nakashima case is a matter of legitimate public interest, and that reporting on it, particularly in true crime documentaries and news programs, is protected by freedom of expression. In January 2021, the São Paulo Court of Justice specifically denied Misael's request for the removal of a true crime television episode about the case, stating that the case had significant social relevance and that the public had a right to know about it. There are aspects of this case that remain unresolved and continue to generate discussion. The murder weapon was never found despite extensive searches. Prosecutors believe it was disposed of, possibly thrown into the reservoir along with Mércia's car or discarded elsewhere along the route, and despite searches involving metal detectors and multiple dive operations, it was never recovered. Misael has never revealed what happened to the firearm, and without a confession, this remains unknown. The exact sequence of events on May 23rd also remains a matter of reconstruction based on evidence rather than direct testimony. While the forensic evidence establishes that Mércia was shot and then drowned in the submerged vehicle, the precise location of the shooting, whether it occurred in Guarulhos or somewhere along the route to Nazaré Paulista, is based on evidence interpretation. Some legal analysts and members of the public have debated whether the conviction, based entirely on circumstantial evidence, met the threshold for proof beyond a reasonable doubt required in criminal cases. However, Brazilian legal experts have noted that circumstantial evidence can be extremely powerful when multiple independent pieces converge to support a single conclusion, as they did in this case. The combination of phone records, DNA evidence, botanical forensics, and motive created what prosecutors called a chain of evidence that left no reasonable alternative explanation. The case also raised questions about police accountability. Misael was a serving police officer when he committed the murder, and his ability to evade arrest for more than a year led to internal investigations within the military police. Some critics suggested he may have received help from fellow officers, though this was never proven. The case contributed to broader discussions in Brazil about domestic violence committed by law enforcement officers and the need for stricter oversight. The Mércia Nakashima case became one of the most high-profile domestic violence homicides in Brazil and contributed significantly to national conversations about gender-based violence. In 2015, Brazil enacted the feminicide law, officially Law 13104, which classified the murder of women in domestic contexts or due to gender-based hatred as a distinct, more severely punished crime. Advocates have pointed to cases like Mércia's as examples of why such legislation was necessary. The law allows for sentences of 12 to 30 years, with increased penalties for aggravating circumstances, and requires that feminicide cases be treated with special priority by the justice system. Mércia Nakashima's family has remained largely private in the years since her death, though they have occasionally spoken to media about the importance of justice and the need for stronger protections for women in abusive relationships. They have stated that no amount of prison time will bring Mércia back, but that they hope her case will serve as a warning to other women in dangerous relationships and will encourage them to seek help. They have also expressed frustration with the lengthy legal process and with the fact that Misael continues to file appeals and lawsuits even after his conviction. Mércia's case has been featured in multiple Brazilian true crime television programs, including episodes of Linha Direta, one of Brazil's longest-running investigative crime shows, and Anatomia do Crime, a documentary series. The case was also covered extensively by Fantástico, Globo's Sunday night news magazine, which followed the investigation and trial closely, providing updates that were watched by millions of Brazilians. The Mércia Nakashima case is a study in forensic persistence and represents a milestone in Brazilian criminal investigation. Without a confession, without an eyewitness, and without a recovered weapon, investigators and prosecutors built a case from phone records, blood evidence, botanical analysis, and the testimony of those who knew both Mércia and Misael. It demonstrated the role that technology and science play in modern criminal investigations, particularly in cases where the accused offers no admission of guilt. The microscopic fragments of algae found in a vehicle trunk, the cellular tower pings recorded automatically by telecommunications systems, the DNA extracted from bloodstains, all told a story that words did not. The case marked one of the first times in Brazilian legal history that forensic botany played a decisive role in a murder conviction, setting a precedent for future cases. It is a reminder that in the pursuit of justice, evidence can speak even when people refuse to, and that science, when properly applied, can reveal truth that might otherwise remain hidden. The case also highlighted the importance of family persistence. Mércia's relatives never stopped pushing for answers, never accepted easy explanations, and their advocacy ensured that the investigation remained a priority even as weeks passed without her being found. If this investigation resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to Brazil's Crime Vault. Your support helps us document more cases with care and detail. Share your thoughts in the comments. Mércia Nakashima was remembered by her family as a woman with a bright future ahead of her, a dedicated professional, and a beloved daughter and granddaughter. Her life was taken on a spring evening in 2010, but the investigation that followed ensured her death was not forgotten, that the evidence was heard, and that justice, though slow, was ultimately served. Her case continues to be studied in forensic science courses in Brazilian universities, and the botanical evidence used in her case has been cited in academic papers on forensic botany, ensuring that Mércia's case has contributed not only to justice in her specific situation, but to the advancement of investigative science that may help solve future cases.